William Muir Edwards in 1905 in Montreal. He was the son of Dr. Oliver Cromwell Edwards, so anybody who knows anything about English history finds that name very interesting.
Yeah.
And Oliver Cromwell Edwards married Henrietta Muir, who became Henrietta Muir Edwards. So anybody who knows anything about Alberta history will recognize that name. We actually have a park here named after her. She was one of the famous five. If anybody has any questions, I can make an attempt to answer them later. So William Muir Edwards graduated from McGill in math and science in 1901, 1902. And he was one of the first science professors recruited by Henry Marshall Torrey. And we moved into Ringhouse 2 in 1911. It wasn't so dreadful coming here from Montreal because we did have some family here. Oliver Cromwell and his wife Henrietta were up north. They worked very closely with the First Nations people providing medical care up there, but we didn't see them very often because travel was not easy, needless to say, in those days. My husband William came here as a professor from 1908. His first big achievement, other than being a professor, was to find out the cause of a typhoid outbreak that occurred here in 1911. Needless to say, as Nora Stover was saying, the plumbing was not great here in the early 1900s, and the sewage and the fresh water were not greatly separated. So there was this huge typhoid outbreak, and my husband managed to figure out where the contamination was happening. He redesigned the whole of the water delivery plant for Strathcona, because we're not a big city yet, and so that was one of his major achievements, which is magnificent. Then in 1914, of course, the First World War started. At that point in time, there were about 500 students here, and I think in science, I'm not sure whether it was the whole university, but certainly in science, there were about 500 students. And of those 500, something like 464 of them were deployed overseas at one point or another. Strangely enough, if you went to the U of A and you joined the Canadian Armed Forces from Alberta, you were not kept with your cohorts from the U of A. You were sent over with the BC guys or the Montreal guys or maybe even the Brit guys. So there was no sense of camaraderie or, contact with your hometown and your home university and all the people you knew and your fellow soldiers who joined up with you. So in 1916, my husband started what was called a Comfort Club. And as part of the Comfort Club, he wrote a newsletter, not all by himself, but he started off this newsletter that would be sent out to all the soldiers who were from Alberta, just to keep them in touch with what's happening to their friends and what was happening at home. And the Comfort Club also sent knitted socks, mittens, hats, scarves, whatever, and cigarettes. So they sent them to their soldiers overseas. Sadly, the first edition of the newsletter was in April 1916, and one of its first items was the death of a student called Arthur Dietz, who was a student here at the U of A, and he died on his first day of battle in 1916. So that was a very sad start to the newsletter, but it did carry on for, I think, until halfway through 1918, when it became, it was amalgamated into another huge national newsletter. So in 1918, my husband, of course you all are aware now that in 1918 there was a huge pandemic. Just as the war was ending, the pandemic started. And although the university hospital was up and running at that time, it was up in 1912, it was decided that Pembina Hall would be evacuated of resident students and turned into a fever hospital. And my husband very generously went to volunteer there. He was not a medical doctor, but he went just to push gurneys and whatever. Sadly, he contracted influenza and died in 1918, 2 days before his 39th birthday. Now, because his students were very, very fond of him, particularly the ones overseas. There was a group of Alberta students who were in France, and they were passing an old chateau that was falling down, and they took a piece of wood from the chateau. One of them was a carver, a woodworker, and he carved a plaque with a wild rose in the centre. It was about a foot square, I think. A wild rose in the centre, and around the outside was the battles they had been in, so Saint-Éloi, Ypres, and Armentières, and the years 1914, 1915. And this guy carved this beautiful plaque, and he kept it with him, and 20 guys from that group signed the back of it. Of those 20 guys that signed it, only 3 came back from the war. And that plaque is actually in Convocation Hall. I personally have never seen it. I'm not sure whereabouts it is in there, but it's supposed to be there. So that was a very sort of sobering piece of a memento from the First World War. Also, of those 463 students that went from here, 82 did not return, and their names are again in Convocation Hall on the wall there. My husband is buried in Mount Pleasant Cemetery, which is here in Edmonton, 105th Street or 106th Street and 63rd Avenue, 64th Avenue. He is buried there. But I'm on my way back to Montreal with my children because I have no means of support here. There are no widows' pensions, no survivors' benefits, no social services, no nothing. So I'm homeless because my husband is not a professor here, he's dead, and I have no money. So I'm going back to Montreal to be with my family.